Hi there, welcome to iTWireTV. Researchers with the Secureworks Counter Threat Unit, or CTU, have identified an uptick in the volume of stolen credentials for sale on underground markets, including from personal employee devices which facilitate entry into corporate networks. This kind of Infostealer malware, responsible for harvesting of corporate data, is a growing threat to enterprises and it's a boon to cybercriminals. In fact, such is the interest that the CTU researchers from Secureworks have noted that one of the leading forums for stolen credentials, the Russian market, has even added a new feature where users can pre-order stolen credentials with a deposit of only $1,000, akin to "tell us what you want us to steal." This development could lead to increased targeting of specific organisations, and it potentially signals an evolution of the access for sale business model as criminals continually look to maximise return investment for their nefarious activities. So here to tell us more about Infostealers is Alex Tilley, Head of Threat Intelligence, Asia Pacific and Japan for Secureworks. G'day, Alex, and thank you. It's always good to see you.
G'day, David. It's great to talk to you again.
Yeah, even on such a serious topic. So I guess let's get started. Firstly, actually, so this information is coming from the Secureworks Counter Threat Unit, and of course, your Secureworks. So, who are Secureworks? Tell us about your business.
Yeah. So Secureworks, we're a security company. Obviously, we do XDR and MSSP stuff, which your viewers will understand. We do all kinds of security stuff. Pen testing, IR services, etc. Globally, we're actually, it's a funny thing, sort of in Australia, we're known a bit, but we're actually quite large in America and in EMEA and throughout the UK and stuff like that. So it's, yeah, we've got clients all around the world from small to very, very large, and we just do security. So I'm very lucky that I get, my job is just to do research and to talk to people like yourself, which is really great. But we do also do, software and products and that sort of stuff.
Fantastic. And so I guess today we're talking about Infostealers. So what are Infostealers?
So there's a very big question, David, very big question to start with. So the way that I describe it is, so back in the olden days when I was a young man and had hair, at the banks, we saw the rise of phishing and then sort of the more commercialized phishing in the early 2000s. And then around the mid 2000s, 2006, 2007, we saw the rise of, there was this thing came out called Zeus. Now, I'm not going to get too in the weeds about names and that sort of stuff, but basically what it is it's a piece of malware that hooks into your web browser of the victim and will monitor what sites you go to, and then at certain points will trigger to steal information you're entering, passwords, usernames, bank transfer details, that sort of stuff, and also can alter your experience of the website. It's actually quite interesting the way it works, when it actually, you will think that you're interacting with the website as normal, but the actual bit of Infostealer has injected a bit of code in there to change what it is that you're seeing or change what you're doing. So the whole idea is to steal data. The clue is in the name, I suppose. It's around, I want to steal the information that you're entering into various websites and systems and that sort of stuff. So key logging with extra added bonuses, basically, let's say.
Sure. And I guess, is this a concern? I mean, the world's a big place. Is this a concern for us? Are Infostealers prevalent in ANZ, do you think?
Yeah, so this is the interesting part. So with my background in banking, I've dealt with Infostealers pretty much my entire career. And what we've seen now is they're moving away from targeting bank credentials, and because in the olden days, they would steal your bank password, log into your account and transfer your money out. That was, very basic, but that was in the olden days. But the banks worked very, very hard and spent a lot of money to try and secure their systems to make that less of an attractive proposition for a criminal. And we saw criminals moving towards things like ransomware and, these sort of things these days, because there's different ways to make money. So we saw a sort of a bit of a downturn in the use of Infostealers to target banking credentials, which was their traditional bread and butter. But now we're seeing this upsurge in using Infostealers to target individual corporations' accounts and like access to your VPN or access to your Outlook web access and that sort of stuff. So whereas before people could rely on their bank to spend the money and the time and the resources to try and secure their systems against these Infostealers, now the eye of Saruman, as it were, has been pointed directly at individual corporations and individual users for other purposes rather than just stealing their money.
Yeah, right. And I mean, you talked about that Zeus one and the things it could do. I guess with these new modern Infostealers, I guess what are the capabilities? What are the things they're capable of doing?
Yeah, it's actually phenomenal. So I look at them as complete spy toolkits, and I don't say that with any sort of hyperbole. That's genuinely what they are. They can do things like screen video recording, and they've been able to do this for years, but they've just sort of refined it. Screen video recording, so they can record your mouse moving around your screen and what you're watching. Screenshotting, they can do reverse proxying, they can do VNC stuff, they can do obviously information stealing of keystroke logging and that sort of stuff, but also things like altering your websites that you visit. They can piggyback on your connections into your network. These things are not to be taken lightly. The capabilities are actually quite phenomenal and have been for a long time. And as I said, they're just getting more and more refined these days with what they can do. Things like, if you have a certificate, a security certificate that you use to access something, they can steal that and replay those and all kinds of things. It's like once they're on your machine, it's not going too far to say that once you've got one of these installed, the bad guy has full control of your computer and everything that you do on it, and has done for 15 years now. But now we're seeing them being used against individuals, which is where it gets interesting.
Yeah, right. And I guess putting it in practical sense, what does it mean then for an enterprise? So somebody on the network, you say they've got, own the machine virtually. What does, I guess, for an enterprise, what does that mean? If an Infostealer has compromised somebody's computer, what can they do with
Yeah,
that?
it really means that they've got full access to your network, and that's where it's really that's why we're sort of publicizing a bit more now, because people seem to have forgotten about them a little bit. If you can think about it that way, people sort of focused on things like DDoS and ransomware and that sort of stuff, but this is often the predicating factor for a ransomware attack. So if we can think back to a group that we called Gold Ulrich, which was also called Ryuk ransomware back in a couple of years ago, they would use an Infostealer called TrickBot, because they knew that once they got it onto a machine in your network or in a corporate network, they could use it to get a direct connection into the network and then load their tooling and do things like stealing credentials and stealing certificates and like mapping out networks and basically getting full control of a network. So once they're on a machine, you need to consider that criminal has full access to your corporate network, which is not a great message, but it is actually the truth, because it's as well as being an information stealer, it's also an access facilitator, if that makes sense. Once it's there, it does grant that access into your network. So, and criminals have obviously long figured that out and are using that to their advantage quite ruthlessly.
Right. And this is what security professionals talk about when they mean, somebody's got access to a machine and they can move laterally around the network and
Exactly. It's
right.
sort of what you might think of it as a toehold, but it's a toehold into a network, but it also gives massive functionality to the attacker to actually use it to then move laterally and all those things inside the network. It's really insidious sort of stuff.
Sure. You mentioned that, oftentimes I guess people can forget about this sort of risk that it's been, I mean, you talk about back in the banking, so this has been a problem for a long time, but maybe people have got a bit blasé. Do you think there are just myths or misconceptions that maybe users and even some security professionals have about combating info stealers?
Yeah, I think it's a two-pronged answer to that question, which is a great question. And I think one is, up until sort of recently, and I use that term in inverted commas, maybe the last couple of years, it's been the bank's problem, right? These things have been a problem for banks. So we just expect that the bank will deploy the resources and spend the money to help protect us, but they'll take care of it. That has been the thinking. But now it's like, no, it's your problem. It's your business's problem. That they've in large parts sort of moved away from banking and going after your direct company there. So I think that is something that we have to sort of worry about. And the second part of it is that analysts, so like we have our we have our security resources in companies. We have a certain number of analysts, and they have all these consoles to look at, and they've got all this information coming at them, and then it pops up and says, hey, I mentioned TrickBot before, which is just one family of InfoStealer. You've got a TrickBot infection on one of your workstations. So oftentimes our analysts are motivated by closing tickets. So we'll close the ticket and move on, right? That's so we'll re-image the box, close the ticket, and move on, or whatever, because we've classed Infostealers as commodity malware. And what's happening now is this so-called commodity malware is being used to facilitate these massive intrusions into networks, and then sometimes ending up with a full ransomware attack. So we, as an industry, we sort of have said, oh, listen, that's just commodity. That's just an Infostealer. Re-image the box, forget about it. But we don't understand that it's part of a much larger directed attack on our companies, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, and so the problem is I can say that and say, yeah, you need to chase down every piece of commodity malware to the nth degree and assume that you're getting targeted and everything's terrible, but that's not the realism, right? The reality is somewhere in the middle. It's let's not just close the ticket and move on, but we obviously don't have the resources all the time to do a full investigation every time. Somewhere in the middle is a sort of a happy point to understand that, are we being targeted? Is this something more than just someone clicked a link and got something that was, an inert piece of old malware? I don't know. So I think there's something in the middle there.
Yeah, right. So I guess they're the myths and misconceptions. What's the truth then? I guess what are the things, what advice can you give to people to actually protect themselves against Infostealers? What strategies do you find work best?
Yeah, so I've been wrestling with this one for quite a while, trying to figure out the best way to sort of approach this, as in how do you protect yourself? And obviously it's multi-factor authentication, right? We need to just assume that a password is compromised. That's genuinely, after 25 years in this business and dealing with security through federal law enforcement and banks and casinos and all kinds of things, that's where I've come to in my head, is that we just need to assume that a password is compromised or will be compromised at some point. So what can we do over and above that? And that is genuinely things like endpoint visibility through XDR, that sort of stuff. That is things like log monitoring, but it's also, multi-factor authentication to stop them getting in the first place. Because yes, they can do things like, proxy through your machine, and they can do, reverse VNC sessions, all this sort of trickery. But at the end of the day, having more than just a password, which they can steal by key logging, is your first line of defense. And that will make a lot of these attacks, bash off the walls, because you do have that extra little bit of protection there. But then I would, I'm trying to not be doom and gloomy about this, David. But it's, even if you put in MFA, you can't just rely and say, yeah, we fixed security, now we're good, right? So security is never done, but it is putting MFA on all of our external accesses in. And then we need to start looking at our log sources and our how are we logging our user behavior sort of stuff. And obviously this goes on forever. But I think at the end of the day, the first part is some type of extra factor than just a password, because passwords, I'm more and more getting to the point where I'm thinking passwords don't exist anymore. It's such a, these Infostealers and these other various methods of stealing passwords are so prevalent, that I think it's one of those situations where there's just, you have to do something more.
Yeah, actually, I'm reminded, Alex, last time we spoke, we talked about, what are some of the basics that security professionals or individual users should be putting in place. And you spoke then about MFA and logging, and, that these are virtually non-negotiables. I guess, what advice would you give to anybody watching this now who isn't using MFA?
Go and do it. No, so I think if I think back to my time at the banks when MFA was very much first coming out, and we spent, banks spent millions of dollars rolling out RSA hard tokens and SMS and all kinds of different, second factors. And these things were hard, and the tokens would always go out of sync, and it was a pain to do because your service desk would get calls out of hours to resync a token. All these things, I remember doing it myself when I was back in the olden days. But now, like I'm not in large enterprise security. Obviously, I'm an Intel guy, but now with things like, you got Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, Salesforce Authenticator, all these different apps that you can do on your phone, which run in secure enclaves and all that sort of stuff. They're not as hard as they used to be. I think when I speak to folks and I sort of say, I bang my little drum about MFA and that sort of stuff, and they sort of say, yeah, but we've got 1,000 other things to worry about before we get to that. It's like, well, your preconception is that it's going to be a real imposition on your staff and a really massive program of work, and these days oftentimes it really isn't. It's obviously it's not basic. I'm not going to say it's click a box, but it's getting pretty close to it. You know what I mean? So I think our preconception that it's going to be a big deal to roll it out, maybe we need to revisit that a little bit and have a bit more of a think about it and actually have a look at what's currently out there and how hard it might be to implement, because you might be surprised at how easy it is to actually get that extra layer of security to stop some of these basic attacks.
Yeah, fantastic. And getting back to the CTU team, so I guess, do you know why they're expecting to see an increase in the volume of corporate credentials that are stolen from compromised personal devices as we move into the new year, into 2023? What's behind that concern?
I I think there's many reasons for it, but my personal view is that it's because the business model of something like ransomware is working.
Yeah.
And that's a terrible thing to say, but that business model is working. And I think people, attackers just want access to more and more corporate networks. And so while the business model of something like ransomware is very mature, the business model also of these Infostealers and their capabilities, as I've said, is really mature. So the two of those things coming together, and we're saying, so like back when I was in law enforcement, we would see regularly stolen databases of stolen keystrokes. So think about just text files. So just text, nothing special, of gigabytes. So gigabytes of stolen credentials. And this is back when I was, a younger man. Now you can only imagine how much data has been stolen subsequently to that is still viable. And that, I think, is one of the kickers, is also it's the whole password changing policy thing. We could be here all day, but it definitely is there. You can find a password from 3 years ago that someone stole, and I'm pretty sure in many cases it'd still work today to access that system. So if you want into a business, all you have to do is say, hi, who's got a password for X company? And so criminals have access to these same troves of stolen data going back years, and they'll just search it, just grep company.com, wait for a second, here's 12 credentials, I'll sell them to you for $500 or whatever. It's, in many cases, it's a pretty safe bet that one of them will work. You know what I mean? So that's where the MFA comes into it, right? So even if you do have that password on that account that you haven't changed in 5 years, because that's the real world, let's be honest, it shouldn't be, but it is. When that bad guy tries to use that account on your network, he won't be allowed in because he hasn't got that second factor. So that's why I sort of bang that drum so loudly, because I know that these troves of data exist, and they go back to 2006 and probably before, and now we're seeing this new stuff where it's sort of like hack to order. And that is going to get interesting. But I think it's all about this whole ransomware, extortion, name and shame type stuff, data dumping and extorting sort of stuff. It all is predicated by getting access into your network. And I think if there's a lack of exploits to your endpoint devices, to your edge devices, like your whatever concentrators and VPN concentrators and proxies, whatever's on the internet, if there's a lack of exploits there, the next best thing is get me a credential so I can just log straight into the VPN. And that's sort of where we're seeing these things going. And also with, Outlook Web Access for business email compromise. Can you get me access to someone's email account? Yeah, here it is. And so I think that business model is basically really well matured, and that's where we're going to see it going.
Yeah, wonderful. No, that's been really insightful, as always, Alex. You're full of helpful information. If I can just summarize, so my understanding then, so we're saying that Infostealers, a huge risk, because effectively they're the gateway drug, or whatever the right term is, for business email compromise, ransomware, all sorts of things. So once somebody's stolen your credentials, they're in your network, they can move around, do all sorts of damage, even personal devices, not just company devices, but personal devices with access to enterprise things aren't immune. So really tackling it at the root. So MFA, even if nothing else, even if no other password hygiene methods, MFA, and on the enterprise side, good logging. Okay, no, that's been really insightful, as always, Alex. I appreciate everything you have to say.
I'm happy to talk. I can talk for days about this stuff. I just want people to be more secure and protected. It's the Wild West out there sometimes.
Yes. I always remember this saying once that people have lost their fear of the internet. I remember when, again, when I was a younger man, back when Amazon first came out, and people were saying, I wouldn't dare give my credit card details to some online website. And now people divulge their details freely. They get an email saying, click here and put in your login details. They will.
It's amazing. It's amazing, and it's the problem. Not to labor the point, but the problem is that the crooks have figured out how to use that to massive advantage. So in the olden days, yeah, they'd do a couple of dodgy transactions on your credit card. They'd buy some iTunes cards and sell them on a forum or something like that. But now it's that whole company doesn't exist anymore because that link was clicked. You know what I mean? Like it's one of those situations where it's just like the consequences of
Yes,
poor security practices are so much larger in 2022 than they were back in the olden days.
that's true. And we've seen some big data breaches in Australia in recent months, and the reputational damage, let alone the financial damage, reputational damage is massive, isn't it?
Oh, it's immense, and it's those very bad days. I've been involved in so many very bad days for people, and I just want people to do a bit to avoid having one of those bad days for as long as possible because they're terrible days.
Yeah. Wow. And so set up MFA, so take 5 minutes to avoid.
Yeah, set up
a-
MFA. Yeah, patch your edge devices, and you're in a much better position. So, and I think if I could just one last bit before we go is people do get. I think we've talked about it before, David. Is people get perfection paralysis. They're like, well, how do I do security perfectly? It's like, don't worry about doing it perfectly. Do a couple of things and then start the next thing and then move towards. And each bit of program of work that you do, because obviously we all have limited resources, and maybe you could work with an external party like Secureworks or whatever you want to do. But as you move through those small programs of work to to implement a small security change, you look back in a year and a half and go, wow, we are way further along our security journey than we were back then. We're much better protected than we were back then. So I think oftentimes people just try and say, well, feel like I can't do it perfectly, so where do I start? It's like, well, just start with MFA, start with patching. Let's, bite off a little bit at a time. And also, I suppose the Essential 8 is always where I fall back on. It's like, just get the Essential 8 from ASD and say, let's start this program of work. But yeah, anyway.
In a talk once about analysis paralysis, I once heard somebody say, look, you've got two choices, do something or do nothing. And
Right?
doing something is better than doing nothing.
Yeah, yeah. And I can't tell you where to go because I don't know the URLs off the top of my head, but definitely, as I mentioned, things like Google Authenticator, Microsoft
Yep.
Authenticator, Salesforce Authenticator, all of these things, investigate them and how they may work for your business. That's the thing. And then don't be afraid to say, well, we're going to try it because it's not as bad as you thought it used to be.
Excellent. That's fantastic, Alex. So if people want to get in touch with Secureworks or yourself, what would be the best way to do that?
Secureworks.com. And then you can go through there. There's some links in there. Obviously I'm on LinkedIn. It's not my face, but I'm there. But yeah, so definitely secureworks.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. So once again, that's Alex Tilley, Head of Threat Intelligence for Asia Pacific and Japan for Secureworks. Thank you so much, Alex. That's been wonderful as always. Great talking to you.
Thank you, mate.